How would they know whether they're on the right track or off track? I think, Jimmy, you had told me about some calculation. That's what I was kind of wanting you to go over.
Yeah, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And a lot of times in the mainstream, they're still stuck on, what is it, total to HDL ratio, you guys? Isn't that kind of what one of the standard panels that they do that ratio? That's kind of an archaic way compared to triglyceride to HDL, right, Dr. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you're going to get a basic lipid panel, triglyceride to HDL ratio is what I look at because it's going to inform the quality of the LDL.
Yes.
So that's kind of the red flag. The LDL higher, that's what people are going to base statin treatment on. But if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is low, then it indicates that you have pattern A type HDL.
Yes.
LDL, which is what you want. So that's why I think the triglyceride to HDL ratio is really good. And if you want to know the exact numbers about what is the threshold for a good triglyceride to HDL ratio beyond the simple one that I gave, Paul Mason gives a good lecture on interpreting lipid panels. And I remember at the end of that lecture, there are some graphs that he pulls up showing exactly how the probability of being pattern A or pattern B tracks with the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So you can look up a YouTube lecture by Paul Mason on interpreting lipid panels and kind of scroll to the end and it'll pop out at you.
Paul is brilliant. I love that particular video. And yeah, it's a proxy marker. It's kind of a poor man's version of the NMR lipo profile. If you have a triglyceride to HDL ratio under 1, as Dr. Nick was noting earlier, and as Dr. John was noting, ApoB is a proxy marker for that LDLP. Again, we don't know whether the particle number actually means anything. I think we all agree on this panel. It's the propensity of the small, dense LDL, trying to keep it as low as possible that you're aiming for.
Yeah, and just because there's so much nomenclature, and I know it gives you guys all a giant headache, pattern A, when Dr. Nick talks about that picture just a big fluffy beach ball. So you have a large fluffy LDL particle, and then pattern B is like a baseball. It's very small. It's the small dense stuff that seems to be more damaging, that's more readily oxidized, that causes more problems in that first layer in your blood vessels. So are you okay with that, Dr. Nick? I'm trying to just give people a mental picture.
Even a BB.
You know, a BB, exactly. So,
I mean, the pattern B does include lots of different types. So I like that analogy, but when you actually look at the spectra, it's the pattern A looks like a big smooth curve, and then the pattern B has lots of spikes. The actual spike tends to still be with a big LDL, but it's just multimodal. But I do love the analogies. One I like to use to kind of explain how LDL is not the bad guy, and this is bringing it down to earth. I realize I like to go into the nomenclature a little bit, but I think about Star Wars and Anakin Skywalker. We're like, Anakin's a good.
Sorry, keep going.
All right, yeah. I can't speak over those, but like, he's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's actually a Jedi Knight or a Jedi Padawan. I don't know Star Wars that well, but he's only bad when he's corrupted by the dark side, by the dark force, and then he becomes Darth Vader, and then he's a bad guy. So you can imagine Anakin as like big fluffy beach ball LDL, like John was saying, Dr. John was saying, pattern A, and then he can get corrupted and turn into small, dense LDL, baseball LDL, or in my analogy, Darth Vader. And then the question is, well, what's the corrupting force? What's the dark side? And the dark side, the corrupting force, is basically sugar. So what happens to turn Anakin or beach ball into Darth Vader or baseball is that the LDL is floating around in your blood. And what's supposed to happen is that after it drops off its fat cargo, the triglycerides in your muscles for fuel, it's supposed to go back to the liver and just get taken up. So if there's a lot of sugar around in your blood, then what happens is the sugar attaches to the LDL molecule, a protein called ApoB, which we've mentioned a couple times, and that blocks LDL being taken back up into the liver. You can even think about ApoB as like the passport, and so it just like gets rid of the passport, and then where does the LDL go? It has nowhere to go, so it gets stuck in the bloodstream. And over time, then it gets oxidized. Things like seed oils can exacerbate that process. It
Yes.
becomes small dense. And then it becomes the little baseball, it becomes the Darth Vader. And because sugar also damages the blood vessel wall, it actually opens up an avenue for that small dense Darth Vader LDL to slip into your artery walls and start to contribute to cardiovascular disease. So there's another analogy. I hope that made sense.
And let me add one more wrinkle to that. The vegetable oils that you noted, very high in omega-6 fats, very inflammatory. They lower your LDL-C, Lindsay. So when you go to your doctor and you should probably try to cook in healthier oils like canola oil, and you do, you will see the LDL go down, but it's at the sacrifice of these large fluffy kind that are protective, and then what's left behind not only gets left behind as a preponderance of small dense LDL, but it oxidizes those. So it makes you even more susceptible to heart disease, even though your LDL-C goes down on your cholesterol panel.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. And those polyunsaturated fats they rust the easiest, meaning oxygen can rip electrons off of those, or other things can rip electrons off of those the easiest, because they have multiple double bonds, and oftentimes those double bonds are conjugated, meaning every other carbon, and that makes it easier to attack them. Olive oil, which is monounsaturated, is more stable than these polyunsaturated fats, and then the saturated fats with no double bonds are the most stable, because there's really not a good place for oxygen to attack. You don't have electrons that can readily be ripped away by oxygen. So just wanted to share that piece as well.
I think the exceptions in the fruit vegetable oil family, I would say, are olive oil, and then macadamia nut and hazelnut oil both have as much or more monounsaturated fat than olive oil. So hazelnut and macadamia nut are useful, of course, avocado oil. And then this one's going to be controversial. I want to see what Dr. John's reaction is. Sesame oil. Dr. John, what are your thoughts on sesame oil?
Sesame oil, I think, is unique because, and I think it may have some health benefits. I know it's been used a lot in the Far East for thousands of years. One thing, it does contain something called sesamin, although I don't know if the oil contains it, but the sesame seeds do. And that sesamin actually changes your production of different eicosanoids. So there's a point where it can go down a good pathway or a bad pathway. The bad pathway makes arachidonic acid, and the good pathway makes prostaglandin E1. And sesamin actually shifts that balance more towards the good pathway. I think it also has a relatively high smoke point, Dr. Nick, so it doesn't burn as easily. I normally cook with avocado oil because it has a high smoke point. And I have used some sesame oil, but I don't use it. I haven't really looked into it enough to know if it's superior, but I do know that the sesame seeds have that very unique molecule that's beneficial.
Yeah, can I go on about that? Because I've been really interested in sesame recently.
Yeah.
Because I am also, I think both of you, Jimmy and Dr. John, generally anti-seed oil. But for the reason you said, Dr. John, that sesamin, it is present in the oil, and I think it actually needs to be in conjunction with enough omega-3s, at least ALA or EPA, so from fatty fish or even flaxseed, to block that delta-5 desaturase enzyme that you alluded to. So that's the one that produces the inflammatory prostaglandins. So that's interesting, but it has a lot of other interesting properties too. So I found one paper showing that sesamin and then actually something called sesmolin and sesamol, it's kind of cousins, block linoleic acid, block omega-6 oxidation. So when you throw those, they're called lignans, when you throw those 3 lignans in with linoleic acid, it just doesn't oxidize. It protects it, which is really interesting. And then another thing is that sesamin in the liver increases alcohol processing and beta oxidation, fat burning genes. That was one of the things that really drew me to it. So I've been recently doing a little sesame oil experiment on myself over the past month. or so, and I noticed when I have about a tablespoon and a half of toasted sesame oil, I actually use Spectrum brand, I just get it at Whole Foods, my morning ketones are so much higher than normal. So normally without the sesame oil, I'd be at like 1.3, 1.6 in that range. And I've been taking a tablespoon and a half of toasted sesame oil just with dinner. And this morning, like, my GKI was 1 and my ketones were 3.3, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if, I know you're like a biohacker like me, Dr. John. I would be interested to see if you could replicate that. But my ketones have been a lot higher. And my HSCRP, I got to retest it. It's below 1. And my HDL has gone up. It's 116. My LDL actually did drop by 173 points. And my triglycerides dropped a tiny bit. They're at 40. So right now I have interesting profile. I'm just really interested in sesame now.
So, Dr. Nick, you've inspired me to go buy some toasted sesame oil and to start experimenting with it. So I'll report back in a month or two and tell you how it's worked for me as well. Very cool.
We're all going to go buy some sesame oil. Thanks, Dr. Nick.
I'd love to go to the next question.
Yes, we are.
At some point, I'd love to talk about why does your body make cholesterol? What do we use it for? What are the good things? Because all you ever hear about is how cholesterol is designed to kill you. And I know people that are so afraid of cholesterol, they won't eat an egg yolk. They'll eat egg whites.
Oh.
And I think to them, that's not a good move.
Oh.
And so at some point, as we have time, I'd love us to talk about why does your body make cholesterol? What does it do to your membranes? What do you use it for in terms of making vitamin D, making estrogen, making testosterone, things like that, because you don't hear that nearly enough, because without cholesterol, we all die. And that, without that, it's as fundamental to life as water. And I wish it didn't get smeared so badly so often. Yes.
And what's amazing about it is people think if they don't eat cholesterol that they can keep their cholesterol levels in their body low. Endogenous production will kick up if you're not feeding yourself cholesterol, and it will downregulate if you feed yourself cholesterol. I remember Steve Finney told a story about how he wanted to test this whole eating eggs will raise your cholesterol nonsense. And so he ate 19 eggs in one sitting. And he tested his cholesterol before and then an obligate amount of time after doing that. You want to know how high his cholesterol went up? 1 point. Because the internal...
The liver says, I don't need to build it.
Exactly.
We're getting plenty in the diet.
Exactly.
Put less in the diet, the liver says, we have to crank up cholesterol synthesis. No, I absolutely agree with you. I will say one thing on the eggs. Cook your eggs gently. You don't want to oxidize the cholesterol when it's in the yolk. So if you're cooking an egg, cook it at the lowest temperature. If you're going to flip it and make it over easy, you want the yolk to be still liquid. You might want to, congeal all the whites, but don't overcook your eggs, because lower temperature and more gently, you don't want to oxidize the cholesterol before you eat it, because now you've turn it in from something that's useful to something that the body now has to deal with and get rid of.
So get used to over easy, people.